The fluorescent lights of Conference Room B hummed with a monotonous indifference that perfectly mirrored my mood. "Congratulations, Marcus," I managed to say, the words feeling like shards of glass scraping against my throat. "My name is Daniel, and at 42 years old, I just witnessed 5 years of my dedicated career at Sterling Solutions get handed over, gift-wrapped, and tied with a nepotistic bow, to a fresh-faced 5-year-old who hadn't even learned where the good coffee machine was yet." Marcus, the recipient of this undeserved promotion, beamed as if he'd personally spearheaded a corporate turnaround. He hadn't. He'd been at the company all of 6 weeks, a fact that hung in the stale, recycled air like a bad odor. The conference table, scarred with years of spilled coffee and forgotten ambitions, felt like a witness to my slow, agonizing defeat. Everyone clapped, a polite, obligatory sound that did little to mask the underlying awkwardness. I clapped too, my hands moving on autopilot while a cold, hard knot tightened in my gut. My manager, Richard Harding, stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out with an almost comical display of pride. "Marcus is going to be a tremendous asset as our new director of client relations for the Northeast," he announced, the words echoing the very title I'd been diligently working towards since 2018. The same promotion I'd been all but promised when Eleanor Vance, the previous director, finally retired her sensible heels. I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded neatly on the table, but inside, a bitter resentment simmered. Marcus was Richard's nephew. It was the worst-kept secret in the entire department. The kid had a brand-new MBA, and the kind of unearned confidence that comes from a life cushioned by privilege. He'd spent the last month shadowing me, observing my meticulously cultivated client relationships, listening in on my high-stakes negotiations, asking rudimentary questions that revealed a fundamental lack of understanding of our industry. And now, he was my boss. "Daniel has been instrumental in bringing Marcus up to speed," Richard added, the words dripping with a patronizing tone that somehow made the situation even more insulting. As if 5 years of consistently exceeding targets, countless late nights, and glowing performance reviews were merely an elaborate onboarding process for someone else's future. I offered a tight, professional smile. "Happy to assist," I said, the lie tasting like poison. The meeting adjourned, the polite applause fading as people filed out, offering Marcus insincere handshakes and well wishes. I gathered my notepad and pen, my movements feeling sluggish, as if wading through thick mud. My mind, however, was sharp and clear, that unsettling clarity that sometimes descends in the dead of night, illuminating truths you'd been subconsciously avoiding. "Daniel, could you stay behind for a moment?" Richard's voice cut through the dispersing crowd. We were left alone in the sterile confines of the conference room. He loosened his tie, attempting a look of sympathetic understanding that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know this might seem unexpected," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But Marcus brings a fresh perspective, a new energy to the role." "Of course," I replied, my voice flat. "And you understand, right? This isn't a reflection on your performance, Daniel. It's purely a strategic decision." I looked at him, really looked at him. Richard was in his late 50s, his hairline receding, his attempts to appear youthful undermined by the worry lines etched around his eyes. He'd climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of competence and an uncanny ability to align himself with the right people. The irony of his strategic decision wasn't lost on me. "I understand perfectly, Richard," I said, the words devoid of any genuine emotion. He visibly relaxed. "Good. I knew you'd be professional about this. That's why you're such a valued member of the team." Valued. Not valued enough for the promotion I had demonstrably earned, but valuable enough to train his inexperienced nephew and then smile about it. I returned to my cubicle, the muted gray walls suddenly feeling more oppressive than ever. The office hummed with its usual daytime activity, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the low murmur of conversations. I opened my laptop, my gaze fixed on the blank screen for a full minute before I began to type. I had joined Sterling Solutions in August of 2018, a year after my divorce finalized. I'd needed a clean break, a fresh start, and the field of supply chain management felt solid, dependable. Sterling Solutions distributed industrial components across the Midwest. Unglamorous work, perhaps, but it paid well and allowed me to sleep soundly at night most of the time. Richard himself had hired me, shaking my hand with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm, saying they needed someone with my experience. After a major competitor poached their senior logistics manager, I'd spent 12 years at my previous company, working my way up from an entry-level analyst position before a corporate restructuring eliminated my entire department. At 37, starting over had been daunting, but Richard had painted a promising picture of growth and opportunity. "We're expanding rapidly, Daniel," he'd said during my interview. "Plenty of room for advancement for the right people." I had diligently, perhaps foolishly, believed I was one of those right people. I had become the reliable workhorse of the department. I routinely stayed late to resolve shipping delays, worked weekends to oversee critical deliveries, and built strong, dependable relationships with suppliers from Ohio to Missouri. My performance reviews were consistently excellent, filled with phrases like "exceeds expectations" and "a key contributor to the team's success." Richard had always been complimentary, full of vague promises of future recognition. "You've got management potential, Daniel," he'd say with a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Just be patient. Your time will come." Patient. I had become an expert in waiting. My son, Ethan, who was 10, stayed with me every other weekend. He was old enough to notice the exhaustion etched on my face, the dark circles under my eyes. Sometimes he'd find me hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, responding to urgent emails. "Dad, it's the weekend," he'd often say, his voice laced with a gentle concern that tugged at my heart. "Just catching up, buddy," I'd reply, forcing a smile. "Building a good future for us." He'd usually just nod, his understanding beyond his years. His mother, Sarah, had remarried a software engineer with a predictable schedule and a comfortable income. I was the dad who missed school events because of work, but always made sure Ethan had the latest video games and never forgot his birthday. The first hint of the coming storm had appeared about 4 months ago, when Richard casually mentioned that his nephew might be joining the company for a summer internship. "Bright young man," he'd said, a little too enthusiastically. "Just graduated with his MBA from Wharton." I'd nodded, thinking nothing of it. Companies hired interns all the time. It was standard practice. They usually started in entry-level positions, learning the ropes from the ground up. But Marcus hadn't started at the ground floor. He'd been given a spacious office down the hall from Richard's, with the impressive-sounding title of Strategic Initiatives Analyst, and a salary that, I suspected, was far more generous than any intern wage. Richard had introduced him around the office with the fanfare usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Marcus is here to observe our processes, learn the intricacies of our operations," Richard had announced, his arm draped proudly across his nephew's shoulders. Marcus had observed by sitting in on my client calls, taking copious notes while I explained complex logistical challenges and asking questions that betrayed a complete lack of practical experience. He was eager, I'll give him that, and unfailingly polite. He used phrases like, "with all due respect," before offering naive suggestions that demonstrated his theoretical knowledge hadn't yet collided with the messy reality of our business. I had patiently answered his questions, shared my insights. Because that's what you do. You help the new guy. Even when the new guy's last name is Harding and his uncle signs your paychecks. Even when a nagging suspicion starts to take root in the back of your mind, whispering uncomfortable possibilities. The moment the suspicion hardened into certainty occurred about 2 weeks ago during a conversation I was never meant to overhear. I'd stayed late to finalize the quarterly performance reports, the office eerily silent except for the rhythmic whir of the ventilation system. I was heading to the break room for a much-needed cup of coffee when I heard voices emanating from Richard's office. His door was slightly ajar, and the quiet hallway carried sound with surprising clarity. "The board is going to raise questions, Richard," a deeper, older voice said. I recognized it as Mr. Henderson from corporate headquarters. "Marcus has only been with us for a month. He's a quick learner," Richard replied, his tone defensive. "And he has the qualifications. Daniel has been with us for 5 years. His performance metrics are outstanding. You yourself have recommended him for the director position multiple times." There was a brief pause, and then Richard's voice, laced with an uncomfortable justification. "Daniel is reliable, a solid performer. But Marcus, well, he's family. And frankly, Mr. Henderson, the board appreciates that kind of long-term commitment. Plus, Marcus has that Wharton pedigree. It carries weight." A cold dread washed over me. Pedigree over performance, family over dedication. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as they casually discussed my future, my years of hard work reduced to a footnote in their plans. "What about Daniel's experience with our key clients?" Mr. Henderson pressed. Richard's response was dismissive. "Daniel will continue to manage his accounts. He's good at it. This is about grooming Marcus for a leadership role. Daniel will be a valuable support." Valuable support, not the leader. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't being groomed for advancement. I was being positioned as the dependable underling, forever in the shadow of the boss's nephew. I quietly backed away from the door, the taste of stale coffee already bitter on my tongue. I returned to my cubicle, saved my work, and left the office, the fluorescent lights casting long, accusing shadows behind me. The drive home was a blur of anger and disillusionment. That night, sleep offered no escape. Richard's words echoed in my mind, each syllable a fresh wave of betrayal. Valuable support. Marcus is family. Wharton pedigree. They were code words for a system rigged against merit, a game I could never win. And the taste of stale coffee had become the taste of my own stagnant career. The days following the announcement were a masterclass in corporate theater. I moved through the office with a practiced, professional demeanor that felt like a carefully constructed costume. I smiled during meetings, offered concise and helpful answers when asked, and maintained a calm, steady presence. On the outside, I was Daniel, the reliable team member, the consummate professional. On the inside, I was a seismograph, registering every tremor of disrespect, every aftershock of the betrayal. A cold, quiet anger had taken up permanent residence in my chest, a silent observer taking meticulous notes. My new reality required me to report to Marcus. Our one-on-one meetings were exercises in absurdity. He would sit in the large director's chair that should have been mine, spouting buzzwords from his MBA textbooks, synergistic leverage, optimizing the value chain, paradigm shifts. He spoke of our clients as data points on a spreadsheet, and our suppliers as variables in an equation. He had no grasp of the human element, the years of trust building and personal relationships that actually made our complex supply chain function. I would nod, offer carefully worded suggestions that gently steered him away from disastrous ideas, and call him boss without letting the word turn to acid on my tongue. It was exhausting. The first real test came on a Wednesday. A critical shipment of specialized steel bearings, destined for our biggest client, a major manufacturer of agricultural equipment called Agritech, was held up in customs in Chicago. A simple paperwork error on the part of the freight forwarder, but one that could shut down Agritech's entire assembly line if not resolved within 24 hours. The client was, justifiably, furious. The call went directly to Marcus. I watched from my cubicle as he took the call, his confident posture slowly deflating as the client's procurement manager, a notoriously tough but fair woman named Brenda, laid into him. Marcus tried to placate her with corporate jargon. "We are actively leveraging all available resources to remediate this logistical bottleneck, Brenda," I heard him say, his voice a little too high. There was a pause. I could imagine Brenda on the other end, completely unimpressed. "I will personally circle back with you once we have a tangible action plan," he finished weakly. He hung up the phone, his face pale. He walked over to my desk, holding a printout of the shipping manifest. "Daniel, we have a situation with the Agritech shipment," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "There appears to be a customs issue. I need you to look into it." I looked at the paperwork. I knew Brenda. I knew the freight forwarder, a man named Sal in Chicago. I knew the customs broker we used. I had built this entire logistical path myself. "Brenda can be tough," I said calmly. "Did you get the specific hold code from her?" Marcus blinked. The what?" "The customs hold code. It tells you the exact reason for the delay. Without it, we're just guessing." "She didn't mention it," he mumbled, looking flustered. "She was mostly just yelling." I suppressed a sigh. "Okay, let me make a few calls." I didn't call Brenda back to further antagonize her. I called Sal, the freight forwarder. We'd worked together for 4 years. I'd sent him a case of his favorite bourbon every Christmas. "Sal, it's Daniel at Sterling. Got a problem with the Agritech shipment." "Danny, my friend." Sal's voice boomed over the phone. "Yeah, your new guy called me. Kid didn't know a bill of lading from a packing slip. Sent over the wrong tariff classification code. It's an easy fix, but the paperwork has to be resubmitted. I can expedite it, but it'll take a few hours." "I owe you one, Sal," I said. "You don't owe me nothing. Just tell your bosses to train the kids before they let them play with multi-million-dollar shipments." I hung up, solved the problem in 10 minutes, with one phone call built on 4 years of mutual respect. I walked back to Marcus's office. "It's handled," I said. "The paperwork was misfiled with the wrong classification code. It's being resubmitted now. The shipment should be cleared by this evening and will be at Agritech's facility by morning. I'll call Brenda and let her know." Marcus looked relieved, but also vaguely annoyed, as if my competence was a personal insult to his authority. Good work, Daniel. "See? Teamwork," he said, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. I just nodded and walked away, the cold knot in my chest tightening. I was still doing the job. I just wasn't getting the title or the salary for it. That weekend was my weekend with Ethan. I picked him up from his mother's house in the suburbs, the perfectly manicured lawn and two-car garage, a stark reminder of the stable, predictable life Sarah had rebuilt. Ethan was a good kid, sharp and perceptive. He knew something was wrong. We were tossing a football in the park on Saturday afternoon when he paused, holding the ball. "So, did you get it?" he asked, his young face serious. "Get what, buddy?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "The new job, the director job. You said you were probably going to get it." The simple, innocent question felt like a physical blow. I had been so excited, so sure. I had shared that excitement with my son. Now, I had to deliver the news of my failure. I sat down on the park bench, and he sat beside me. "No, buddy, I didn't get it," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "They decided to go with someone else." "Who?" "A new guy. His name is Marcus." Ethan frowned. "But you've been there forever. You work so hard. You said you were the most qualified." "Well, sometimes. Sometimes companies make different decisions. Marcus has a fancy business degree. They thought he'd bring new ideas." The words tasted like lies. Ethan, with the brutal honesty of a child, saw right through it. "Is he better than you?" I looked at my son, at his trusting, expectant face. And in that moment, I couldn't lie to him. I couldn't pretend this was a fair outcome. "No," I said softly, but with a firmness that surprised me. "No, he's not, but his uncle is my boss." Ethan's face fell in understanding, even at 10 years old. He understood unfairness. He kicked at a loose patch of dirt with his sneaker. "That stinks, Dad." "Yeah," I said, "it does." We sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the park, other kids laughing, dogs barking, feeling like they were from another world. My failure wasn't just a private professional disappointment anymore. It was real. It was a story I had to tell my son, a story where working hard and being the best didn't guarantee a win. And I hated it. I hated the lesson it was teaching him. That night, after Ethan was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd so often seen me working on weekends. I opened my laptop. For years, my first instinct would have been to open my work email, to get a head start on Monday, to prove my value. But the conversation in the park had changed something in me. Being a valued team member at Sterling Solutions now felt like a consolation prize for fools. Being patient felt like another word for being a doormat. I didn't open my email. I opened a web browser. I navigated to LinkedIn, a site I hadn't updated in years. I stared at my own profile picture, a slightly younger, more optimistic version of myself. My job title read, Senior Logistics Manager at Sterling Solutions. My finger hovered over the mouse. Richard thought I was a workhorse who would keep my head down and pull the plow. He thought my responsibilities, my need to provide for my son, had me trapped. He was wrong. They weren't a trap. They were the reason I had to fight back. With a decisive click, I started updating my profile. I rewrote my summary, quantified my achievements, and listed my core competencies. It was a small, quiet act, invisible to the world. But it was the first step. It was the sound of a key turning in the lock of a cage I had just realized I was in. I wasn't just going to be patient anymore. I was going to be strategic. My LinkedIn profile, polished and updated, sat silently on the web, a digital declaration of intent that only I understood. In the office, however, my strategy shifted from passive anger to active observation. I became an anthropologist studying the bizarre corporate ecosystem of Sterling Solutions. I performed my job with the same meticulous efficiency as always, but my perspective had changed. I was no longer a loyal employee building a career. I was a consultant gathering intelligence before a planned departure. The first part of my plan was to network. It had to be subtle. I started by scheduling catch-up lunches with former colleagues who had moved on to other companies and with key suppliers I had built strong relationships with. These weren't job interviews. They were reconnaissance missions. My first lunch was with a man named Frank Miller, a gregarious sales manager for one of our largest freight carriers. We met at a steakhouse downtown, the kind of place Richard took clients he wanted to impress. "So, how are things at Sterling?" Frank asked after we ordered. "Heard you've got some new blood in management." The industry grapevine was ruthlessly efficient. "We do," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Richard's nephew, Marcus, has come on board. He's taking over the Director of Client Relations role." Frank raised an eyebrow, but was too professional to comment directly on the nepotism. "Huh. Young guy, right? MBA? I nodded. Well, Frank said, leaning in slightly. Hope he knows what he's doing. Your biggest asset has always been your stability. Companies like Keystone Logistics have been trying to poach your clients for years by promising lower costs, but they can't match your on-time delivery record. That's all you, Danny. Everyone knows it. Keystone Logistics. I mentally filed the name away. They were our biggest competitor in the region, aggressive, tech-savvy, and known for promoting based on performance, not last names. Just keeping the trains running on time, I said with a non-committal smile. The conversation moved on, but the seed was planted. The world outside Sterling Solutions was aware of my value, even if my own boss wasn't. The following Monday, Richard called me into his office. Marcus was there, sitting in a chair slightly to the side, looking like a student waiting for his assignment. Daniel, Richard began, a magnanimous smile plastered on his face. In the interest of a smooth transition and Marcus's professional development, I'd like you to formally take on the role of his mentor. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. He wanted me to officially train the man who had stolen my job. The old Daniel would have bristled, would have felt the sting of humiliation. But the new, strategic Daniel saw an opportunity. Of course, Richard, I said smoothly. I think that's a great idea. It's crucial that Marcus understands the nuances of our key accounts. I'd be happy to put together a structured development plan for him. Richard beamed, relieved. Excellent. I knew I could count on you. I spent the next 2 weeks creating what I privately called the playbook. It was a comprehensive set of documents, guides, and standard operating procedures for every facet of my job. I detailed the communication protocols for our top 10 clients, including personal notes on the procurement managers who preferred phone calls over emails, who was a stickler for detail, whose assistant really ran the show. I created flowcharts for managing customs delays, emergency contact lists for every freight carrier, and step-by-step guides for troubleshooting our arcane inventory management software. On the surface, it was an act of supreme professionalism, a testament to my dedication to the company. In reality, it was my insurance policy. I was creating a manual so detailed that, when I left, the clients I had nurtured would experience minimal disruption. My departure would not be the cause of chaos. The chaos would only begin when Marcus inevitably tried to deviate from the system I had built. The playbook was also my portfolio. It was a tangible, undeniable record of the value and expertise I brought to the table. It was my resume, written in the language of pure competence. My mentoring sessions with Marcus became a surreal performance. I would sit with him in a conference room, walking him through the playbook. He was a diligent student, taking copious notes, but he lacked any intuitive feel for the business. So, for the Agritech account, I explained one afternoon, pointing to a flowchart. If a shipment from the supplier in Dayton is delayed by more than 6 hours, you immediately trigger the Plan B protocol. You call our secondary supplier in Fort Wayne, authorize the expedited shipment from their reserve stock, and simultaneously notify Brenda's logistics coordinator, not Brenda herself, to give them a heads up. The key is to solve the problem before it ever reaches Brenda's desk. Marcus frowned, tapping his pen on his notepad. But from a cost analysis perspective, wouldn't it be more efficient to first ascertain the root cause of the Dayton delay? Expedited shipping from a secondary supplier incurs significant premium charges. It does, I conceded, but a single day of shutdown on their assembly line costs Agritech over $1 million. They're not just a client, they're our partner. We absorb the $50,000 shipping premium to protect them from $1 million loss. That's why they've been loyal to us for 10 years and haven't jumped ship to Keystone. It's not about the cost of one shipment. It's about the value of the relationship. He nodded slowly, writing it down, but I could tell he didn't truly grasp it. He saw the numbers on the page, not the intricate web of trust and history that lay beneath them. He was learning the words, but he couldn't hear the music. My quiet networking began to bear fruit. Frank Miller, the sales manager, called me a week later. Danny, just wanted to give you a heads up. Heard from a buddy over at Keystone Logistics. They just landed a massive new contract on the West Coast and are expanding their operations team. They're creating a new senior role, something strategic, to manage the integration. Sounds right up your alley. My buddy's name is Dave Wilson. He's a VP there. Might be worth a call. It was the opening I had been waiting for. That night, after Ethan was in bed, I sat at my kitchen table and composed the most important email of my professional life. I introduced myself to Dave Wilson, mentioned our mutual acquaintance, Frank Miller, and attached my newly polished resume. I kept it brief, professional, and confident. I didn't mention my situation at Sterling. I simply stated that I was exploring new opportunities where I could apply my strategic experience in a growth-oriented environment. I hit send and felt a jolt of adrenaline, a feeling of pure, unadulterated agency. I was no longer waiting for Richard Harding to decide my worth. I was taking control. The reply came less than 24 hours later. It was from Dave Wilson himself. Daniel, thanks for reaching out. Frank speaks very highly of you. Your resume is impressive. I've heard good things about the work you've done managing some of the most demanding accounts in the Midwest. The new role Frank mentioned is Director of Strategic Operations. It requires someone who can not only manage complex logistics, but also build the systems to support rapid growth. It sounds like it could be a perfect fit. Would you be available for a preliminary conversation next week? I read the email 3 times. Director of Strategic Operations. The title felt like a vindication. They weren't just looking for a reliable manager. They were looking for a builder, a strategist. They were looking for me. I closed my laptop, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time in weeks. The good soldier was done waiting for orders. The consultant had gathered his intelligence. The next phase of the operation was about to begin. The week leading up to my interview with Keystone Logistics was a masterclass in duality. I existed in 2 separate realities. In one, I was the diligent, professional senior logistics manager at Sterling Solutions, patiently mentoring my new, unqualified boss and ensuring the smooth operation of a department that no longer saw a future for me. In the other, secret reality, I was a strategist preparing for the most important meeting of my career. Every evening, after Ethan was asleep, I would transform my kitchen table into a war room. I didn't just review my resume, I prepared a full presentation. I analyzed Keystone's market position, their recent growth, and their publicly stated goals. I identified their logistical strengths and, more importantly, their potential vulnerabilities, areas where my specific expertise could be an immediate asset. I took the agri-tech crisis from a few weeks prior and turned it into a case study. I anonymized the client and supplier names, but detailed the problem, the flawed initial response, Marcus's textbook approach, and my ultimate solution, which was rooted in relationships and proactive systems. I wasn't just going to tell them I was good at my job, I was going to show them. I was preparing not just to ask for a job, but to demonstrate that I was already thinking like their Director of Strategic Operations. It was the most focused, energized I had felt in years. I wasn't just reacting to a betrayal anymore. I was architecting my own triumph. On the day of the interview, I took a personal day, telling Richard I had a dentist appointment. The lie came easily. The Keystone Logistics office was located in a newer, more modern part of the city, in a sleek building of glass and steel. The difference from Sterling's dated wood-paneled headquarters was immediate and striking. The lobby was open and buzzing with a quiet, focused energy. Young, diverse employees moved with purpose. The air didn't smell of stale coffee and resignation, it smelled of possibility. Dave Wilson was exactly as I had imagined from his email correspondence, sharp, direct, and radiating a no-nonsense intelligence. He was in his late 40s, fit and energetic, with a firm handshake and eyes that seemed to assess everything at once. He didn't lead me to a stuffy boardroom, but to a comfortable corner office, with a whiteboard covered in complex diagrams and a panoramic view of the city. "Daniel, thanks for coming in," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "No need to stand on ceremony. I've read your resume. Frank Miller swears by you. Let's talk about why you're really here. What's wrong at Sterling?" The directness was disarming. I had prepared a carefully crafted, diplomatic answer, but looking at Dave, I knew that wouldn't work. He wasn't a man who appreciated corporate spin. They promoted my boss's nephew, a recent MBA graduate with 6 weeks of experience, to the director position I had been promised for the last 2 years. I said simply. Dave nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't offer sympathy. He just absorbed the information. Nepotism. It's a cancer in a business. It prioritizes loyalty to family over loyalty to the customer. So, you're looking for a meritocracy. I'm looking for a place where performance and experience are the primary metrics for advancement, I corrected gently. I'm looking for a seat at the table where strategy is made, not just executed. Good answer, he said with a slight smile. So, show me. If you had a seat at our table, what would be the first thing you'd address? This was my opening. I pulled out my laptop and walked him through my case study of the customs crisis. I didn't just present the problem and solution, I presented the underlying philosophy. The initial response was to analyze cost, I explained, But the real issue was a failure of the relationship management system. The solution wasn't just fixing the paperwork, it was having a pre-existing trusted relationship with the freight forwarder and a deep understanding of the client's operational vulnerabilities. At Keystone, as you scale, you can't rely on individual heroics. You need to build a resilient, proactive system. You need to turn relationships into a documented, scalable asset. For the next hour, we didn't have an interview. We had a strategy session. We talked about supply chain resilience, predictive analytics, building out secondary supplier networks. I wasn't just answering questions, I was contributing. I felt like a peer, a colleague. The feeling was intoxicating. As the meeting wrapped up, Dave walked me to the elevator. "Daniel, you've given me a lot to think about," he said. "This isn't just about filling a role for us. It's about finding the right partner to help us build our next phase of growth. We have a few more candidates to speak with, but you've set a very high bar." I walked out of that glass building and into the bright afternoon sun, feeling a sense of confidence I hadn't felt in a decade. I knew I had nailed it. Back at Sterling, the atmosphere had subtly soured. My brief taste of a functional, energetic workplace made the stagnation at my own company all the more apparent. Marcus, armed with the first draft of the playbook I had given him, was trying to assert his new authority, but he was like a child wearing his father's oversized suit. He called a team meeting to reevaluate our vendor scorecards, a project that was both unnecessary and based on a chapter he'd read in a textbook. He spent an hour talking about KPIs and metrics, while my team, exchanged weary, knowing glances. He was rearranging the deck chairs on a ship he didn't know how to steer. Later that week, a new crisis erupted. A different supplier had a critical equipment failure, delaying a shipment of components for another key client. It was a situation that required a nuanced diplomatic touch. I saw the frantic email chain. I saw Marcus's initial response, which was to quote the penalty clauses in their contract, an approach that was guaranteed to incinerate the relationship. I knew exactly who to call and what to say to smooth things over, to find a workaround. But this time, I hesitated. I watched. I let him struggle for a few hours. It was a small, petty act, but it was also a necessary one. I needed to see what would happen if I wasn't there to steer the ship. The chaos I witnessed, the frantic calls and escalating emails, was all the confirmation I needed. I was detaching. My sense of responsibility was shifting. The call from Keystone came the following Tuesday. It was Dave Wilson himself. "Daniel," he said, his voice warm and decisive. "I've met with the other candidates. They were good. You were better. We've discussed it internally, and we are all in agreement. We'd like to formally offer you the position of Director of Strategic Operations." He laid out the details. The salary was a 35% increase over my current pay. There was a significant performance bonus, better stock options, and a generous relocation package if I chose to move closer to the city office. But more important than any of that was the role itself. It was a chance to build, to create systems, to lead. It was a role built on respect for my experience. "The offer is contingent on a background check, of course," Dave concluded. "We'd like you to start in 3 weeks, if possible." "I'll need to give my current employer 2 weeks' notice," I said, my voice steady despite the wild, triumphant beating of my heart. "Of course," Dave said. "We respect that. We'll send the official offer letter over via email within the hour." "Daniel, we're very excited to have you join the team." I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair, in my gray, soulless cubicle. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I looked across the office floor and saw Marcus, rubbing his temples, looking utterly defeated by the supplier crisis he had exacerbated. I saw Richard's closed office door, a symbol of the cronyism and stagnation that had defined my last 5 years. I held the future in my hands. The power wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. I opened my email, and there it was. The offer letter from Keystone Logistics. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a key. It was an escape route. It was my vindication. And I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. I signed the offer letter from Keystone Logistics at my kitchen table that night, the pen moving with a steady, deliberate stroke. It was more than a signature. It was an act of liberation. The next morning, I walked into Sterling Solutions feeling like a different man. The gray, fabric-covered walls of my cubicle no longer felt like a cage, but like a temporary holding cell from which I was about to be released. I spent the morning methodically organizing my files, updating the final sections of the playbook, and answering emails with a detached efficiency. I was waiting for the right moment. It came at 4:30 p.m. on Friday. The office was beginning to wind down, people were packing up for the weekend, and Richard was in his office, likely dreaming of his weekend golf game. I printed my resignation letter. It was short, professional, and unapologetic, and walked to his office. I knocked once on the open door. "Richard, do you have a moment?" "Daniel, sure, come on in," he said, looking up from his computer, a weary but placid end-of-week expression on his face. I placed the letter squarely in the center of his desk. "This is my formal 2-week notice," I said, my voice even and calm. He blinked, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He picked up the letter, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief as he read. A short, disbelieving laugh escaped his lips. "Okay, Daniel, what is this really about? Are you angling for a bigger counteroffer? If this is about money?" "It's not about money, Richard." I cut him off, my politeness unwavering. "I've accepted another position. My last day will be 2 weeks from today." The amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a dawning sense of panic. This wasn't a bluff. He stood up, his professional mask slipping. "Another position? Where? You can't be serious. After 5 years, you're just going to walk away?" "I believe it's the best decision for my career path," I said, using the kind of sterile corporate language he would understand. His panic quickly curdled into anger. His face reddened. "Let me guess. Keystone?" he spat. "That snake Dave Wilson has been trying to poach my people for years." "I'm not at liberty to discuss my new employer," I replied. "I'm here to discuss a professional transition plan for my responsibilities." "A professional transition?" He scoffed, his voice rising. "There's nothing professional about this, Daniel. It's childish. You didn't get the promotion, so now you're taking your ball and going home? Is that it?" I remained silent, letting his accusations hang in the air. My silence seemed to infuriate him more than any argument could. "You know what this is?" he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's career suicide. You think you can just walk out and get a comparable job? I won't give you a good reference. You understand that, don't you? I'll tell them you're unprofessional, that you're not a team player, that you quit in a fit of pique. No one will want to touch you." There it was. The threat. The attempt to put me back in my box by controlling my future. But the threat was hollow. I already had the job. He had no more power over me. "That's your prerogative, Richard," I said calmly. He leaned across his desk, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Think about your responsibilities, Daniel. You have a son, a mortgage. You think now is the time to be throwing a tantrum? You need this job." "I've considered all my responsibilities," I said, my gaze unflinching. "And one of my responsibilities is to myself, to not spend my career in a place that doesn't value my contributions." For the first time, Richard seemed to realize he had truly lost control. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. He tried one last, desperate tactic: negotiation. "Okay," he sighed. "Look, maybe I was hasty. The director title. It's just a title. We can make you associate director. You'd still manage the key accounts. Your compensation would be adjusted. You and Marcus could work as co-heads of the department." It was a pathetic, transparent offer, a made-up title so I could do all the real work while his nephew kept the corner office. It was a bigger, more comfortable cage, but it was still a cage. "Thank you for the offer, Richard, but my decision is final," I said. "I will use the next 2 weeks to ensure the smoothest possible transition for Marcus and the team. I have already prepared extensive documentation." Richard's face darkened into a final, resentful scowl. "Fine," he snapped. "Be out of here in 2 weeks, but don't expect a farewell lunch." I walked out of his office, the weight of the last 5 years lifting from my shoulders with every step. The news of my resignation spread through the office grapevine with astonishing speed. By the time I got back to my desk, I had a few instant messages from coworkers. Some were shocked, some envious, some quietly supportive. "Good for you," one message read. "This place has been a dead end for years." The next week was one of the most surreal of my life. I was a ghost, haunting my own job. Richard avoided me entirely, communicating only through curt emails. Marcus, on the other hand, was in a full-blown panic. The safety net he didn't even know he had was being publicly removed. He came to my desk on Monday morning, the playbook clutched in his hand like a religious text. "Daniel," he said, his voice hushed and desperate, "my uncle is upset. He won't even talk to me about the Agritech account. There's a new tariff issue, and I don't understand any of the documentation you wrote about it." I looked at him, a kid, in an expensive suit, completely out of his depth. My anger wasn't directed at him. He was just a pawn, a symptom of the disease. "Sit down, Marcus," I said, pulling up a chair. "Let's walk through it." I spent my final days at Sterling Solutions, doing exactly what Richard had accused me of, training my replacement. But my motives were my own. I wasn't doing it for Richard or for the company. I was doing it for the clients who depended on us and for my own professional pride. I would not leave a mess behind. I answered every one of Marcus's questions patiently. I walked him through my systems. I made sure he had the best possible chance to succeed, not for his sake, but for mine. Leaving a functioning department behind was the ultimate proof of my competence. The end came sooner than expected. On Thursday of my final week, Richard called me into his office. He didn't ask me to sit. "Clean out your desk, Daniel," he said, his tone flat and cold. "Your services are no longer required. We'll pay you for your final week. Just hand over your security badge and laptop to HR on your way out." I understood immediately. A major client must have called, expressing concern about my departure. My continued presence in the office for another week was now a liability. It was Richard's final, petty attempt to exert control, to rob me of a proper goodbye with my colleagues. But it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like an early parole. "Thank you, Richard," I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time. I packed my personal belongings into a small cardboard box. My coffee mug, a picture of Ethan, a few books. As I walked through the office, a few colleagues came over to shake my hand quietly, wishing me luck. I stopped at Marcus's office. He stood up, looking lost. "Good luck, Marcus," I said. "The playbook has everything you need. Just trust the system." "Thanks, Daniel," he said, his handshake surprisingly firm. "For everything." I walked out of the Sterling Solutions building for the last time, carrying the small box of my past life. The late afternoon sun was warm on my face. I didn't look back. I put the box in my car, but instead of driving home, I drove to the park. I sat on the same bench where I had told Ethan I didn't get the promotion. I took out my phone and called him. "Hey, buddy," I said when he answered. "Guess what? Daddy got a new job, a much better one." I could hear the smile in his voice. "For real, Dad? That's awesome." "Yeah," I said, leaning my head back and looking up at the clear blue sky. "It is." The weight was gone. The silence of the suburbs, the stale air of the office, the years of quiet resentment, it all vanished. I was free. My first day at Keystone Logistics felt like stepping into a different reality. The office was an open-plan space, buzzing with a focused energy that was collaborative, not competitive. There were no closed doors, no hushed political conversations in the hallways. Data and logistics diagrams were displayed on large screens, and teams were gathered around whiteboards, actively solving problems together. When Dave Wilson introduced me to my new team, he didn't introduce me as a reliable manager. He introduced me as the architect of our new strategic operations. I was handed a laptop, a security badge, and a level of trust and autonomy I hadn't experienced in over a decade. My first 90 days were a whirlwind of productive, exhilarating work. I was given the green light to implement the systems I had theorized about and documented in the playbook. I built a new, centralized communication portal for our key accounts. I worked with the tech team to integrate predictive analytics into our shipping schedules to anticipate delays before they happened. I was building, creating, and solving complex problems, and my input was not just valued, it was sought after. For the first time in years, I wasn't just putting out fires, I was designing a more fireproof system. The work was demanding, but I would leave the office feeling energized, not drained. The most significant change, however, was personal. My weekends with Ethan were no longer bracketed by a cloud of work-related anxiety. We went to baseball games, built elaborate Lego creations, and had long conversations that weren't interrupted by the ping of my work phone. One Saturday, as we were washing my car in the driveway, he looked at me and said, "You seem happier, Dad." It was a simple observation, but it struck me with the force of a thunderclap. He was right. The weight I had been carrying for years was gone, replaced by a lightness I had forgotten was possible. News from Sterling Solutions trickled in through my network. Frank Miller, my freight carrier contact, called me about 2 months after I had started at Keystone. "Danny, you are not going to believe this," he said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "The wheels are coming off the wagon over at Sterling. Agritech is officially putting their contract out for bid. Brenda is furious. Says the service has fallen off a cliff since you left. Apparently your replacement, the nephew, what's-his-name, tried to renegotiate their freight charges based on some new cost-saving metric he came up with. Insulted the hell out of them. It was the first of many such calls. Marcus, without my guidance and without the intuition that comes from experience, was trying to manage the department purely by the textbook. He was alienating long-term clients by treating them like spreadsheets, and he was making costly errors that were causing significant delays. Richard, in a panic, was trying to micromanage everything, further muddying the waters and frustrating the remaining competent people on the team. The inevitable happened about 4 months after my departure. Dave Wilson called me into his office. He had a grin on his face. "Well, Daniel," he said, "it seems your reputation precedes you. I just got off the phone with Brenda at Agritech. She wants to know if Keystone would be interested in submitting a proposal for their Midwest logistics contract. She had one condition, that you personally oversee the account." Over the next 2 months, 3 more of my former key clients from Sterling followed suit. They were leaving a sinking ship and looking for a safe harbor, and my name was the one they trusted. We won all 4 contracts. It was a massive, game-changing success for Keystone, and it solidified my position as a key leader within my new company. I felt a surge of triumph, but it was a cleaner, less vengeful feeling than I would have expected. It wasn't about Richard's failure. It was about my success. The final act of the Sterling drama played out in a trade publication I read a year after I had left. The article was a dry, corporate post-mortem on the decline of Sterling Solutions' once dominant Midwest division. It detailed a catastrophic loss of market share, a string of client defections, and a subsequent internal investigation by the board of directors. The investigation had uncovered managerial malfeasance and rampant nepotism, leading to the immediate termination of Richard Harding. Marcus Harding, the article noted, had resigned several months prior to pursue further education. Richard's empire, built on a foundation of shortcuts and bad faith, had crumbled under the weight of its own incompetence. I folded the magazine, feeling not a sense of glee, but a quiet, somber sense of closure. His downfall was the natural consequence of his own actions. My role in it had simply been to walk away and refuse to be a part of it any longer. A year later, I was in Chicago for a conference. I was sitting in a coffee shop near my hotel when a familiar face caught my eye. It was Marcus. He looked different, less like a polished MBA and more like a regular person. He was reading a textbook, and he looked up as I approached his table. A flicker of recognition, then apprehension, crossed his face. "Daniel," he said, surprised. "Marcus," I replied with a nod. "Mind if I sit?" He gestured to the empty chair. "Please." An awkward silence hung between us for a moment. I heard you landed on your feet," he said, gesturing vaguely. "That you're doing big things at Keystone." "Things are going well," I said. "How about you? Back in school?" He nodded, a flush of embarrassment coloring his cheeks. He tapped the textbook. Supply Chain Management. The real version this time. Figured I should probably learn how to do the job before I try to manage it. He offered a small, self-deprecating smile. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry. About everything. I was young, arrogant, and I had no idea what I was getting into. You were right about all of it. I was in way over my head. We were both put in an impossible situation," I said, and I meant it. "Maybe," he said, his gaze dropping to his book. "But you had earned that job. I hadn't. My uncle. He taught me a valuable lesson, just not the one he intended to." We talked for a few more minutes. He was smart, and now he was humbled. He would be fine. I paid for his coffee and shook his hand before I left. There was no anger left, no resentment. He wasn't the enemy. He was just a kid who had learned a hard lesson. That evening, I called Ethan. I told him about my day, about running into Marcus. "Was it weird?" he asked. "A little," I admitted. "But it was okay. He's okay." "You did the right thing, Dad," Ethan said, his voice, now that of a teenager, filled with a simple, unwavering certainty. "By leaving." And I knew he was right. My revenge wasn't seeing Richard fail or Marcus humbled. My real victory was sitting in a hotel room, in a city I was visiting for work I loved, talking to my happy, well-adjusted son. It was the quiet pride of knowing I had built a new life, not on the ashes of my old one, but on a foundation of my own self-worth. I had learned that the most valuable asset you can have isn't a title or a corner office, but the freedom to walk away from a table where respect isn't being served. And I had built a better table.